In the history of American criminology, there are cases that make even experienced detectives shudder. The murder of a young mother and her little son in Renton, Washington became one of them. The case, which stretched over decades, shocked not only with the details of the crime but also with how long the killer remained unpunished. On October 23, 1971, a girl was born in an ordinary American family. Her parents named her Stacy Ann Falcon. She grew up surrounded by care and love, had an older brother, although her parents later divorced. Despite this, Stacy grew up to be a cheerful and sociable girl who easily found common ground with her peers. During her studies in high school, fate brought her together with a boy named John. Young and full of hope for a bright future, they decided to start a new life in California right after graduation. Soon, the couple had a son, Jacob, and it seemed that a long and happy life awaited them. But dreams of an ideal future were shattered by harsh realities. After several years of living in California, the couple decided to return to their native Renton. It was here that their relationship began to rapidly deteriorate, and eventually they broke up. Stacy had to raise her son alone. At her 22 years old, she bravely accepted the challenge of fate. She got a job as a waitress, rented a modest apartment in a residential complex, and did everything possible so that Jacob would not be in need of anything. In the fall of 1994, Stacy was preparing to celebrate her birthday. On October 23rd, she decided to surprise her mother and came to her with her son. Although they lived in the same city, the distance between their homes was considerable, and Stacy's tight work schedule left little time for visits. 4 days later, on her next day off, the young woman decided to celebrate her birthday with friends. She left Jacob with a trusted babysitter and spent the evening visiting several clubs. After midnight, Stacy went to pick up her son. Around 1:30 in the morning, she arrived at the babysitter's house, took Jacob, and they set off for home. No one could have predicted that this trip would be their last. Approximately 2 hours later, a newspaper delivery worker began his morning route in the same area. Driving past a short street that ended in a dead end, he noticed a parked car, and next to it were two motionless bodies, a woman and a small boy. The man immediately dialed 911, and within minutes, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. Experts quickly confirmed the worst fears. Both victims were dead from gunshot wounds. They were Stacy and her little son Jacob. Detectives began a thorough examination of the crime scene and immediately discovered several unusual details. Near the car, they found bullet casings and Stacy's personal belongings, including her cell phone inside the vehicle. But what puzzled investigators the most was that the shoes of both victims were lying several meters from the car. It seemed that the killer had deliberately removed their shoes, but why? Another strange fact was that Stacy's wallet and jewelry remained untouched, which immediately ruled out robbery as a possible motive. At the crime scene, 3 white buttons were also found, which clearly did not belong to Stacy. Investigators speculated that they could have been left by the killer. The car keys were found stuck between the door and the driver's seat. Next to them lay used duct tape, which led detectives to think perhaps the criminal's initial plan was to steal the car, and he planned to leave Stacy and Jacob tied up. Medical experts confirmed that both victims died from gunshot wounds. Numerous defensive wounds were found on Stacy's body, indicating a desperate struggle with the attacker. This version was confirmed by the dirt on her socks and the trampled grass near the car. Investigators speculated that Stacy managed to break free from the attacker and even reach the car, but she did not have time to start it. The criminal pulled out a gun, shot her first, then Jacob, after which he pulled their bodies onto the road. Experts found no signs of sexual assault, which also ruled out this possible motive. Questioning of the local residents also did not yield significant results. Some residents heard a woman scream and gunshots around 2:11 in the morning, but no one called the police. They explained this by the fact that the area was not safe, and the sound of gunshots was not uncommon here. Having excluded robbery and sexual assault as possible motives, the police focused on searching for suspects among Stacy's close circle. Her mother was the first to be questioned. That morning, she was working in a cafe when detectives came to report the terrible news. Her reaction was devastating. The woman ran out of the cafe and ran several blocks before falling to the ground in tears. When the officers managed to calm her down, they began asking about possible enemies of her daughter. From the mother, the detectives learned that Stacy once lived in the same residential complex as the babysitter she entrusted Jacob to that night. But after hearing gunshots nearby one evening, she decided to move. Since then, she lived in another area, but from time to time left her son with the same babysitter she trusted. The mother also said that at the time of her death, Stacy was dating a man named Rich. According to her, their relationship seemed quite normal. Rich got along well with Jacob and spent most of his time in his own apartment. Detectives interrogated Rich, and he said that he had spent the evening in a bar near Stacy's residential complex. Later, when Stacy was still celebrating her birthday with friends, he went to her apartment and fell asleep there because he did not want to drive home after a few drinks. Rich claimed that he woke up early in the morning, and at first did not attach any significance to the absence of Stacy and Jacob. He assumed that they had returned while he was sleeping, and then left without waking him up. Rich denied any involvement in the murders and agreed to take a polygraph test. However, the results turned out to be inconclusive. The operator noted several questionable answers, which did not allow for completely excluding him from the list of suspects. However, there was no direct evidence of his involvement in the crime. Witnesses from the bar confirmed that they saw him there that evening, and investigators could not find any apparent motive for the murder of Stacy or Jacob. Without reliable leads, the detectives decided to dig deeper into Stacy's personal life. They paid attention to her ex-husband, Jacob's father. He said that on the night of the murder, he was drinking with friends, then returned home, played a game of pool with his roommate, and went to bed. His friends confirmed this story, but as with Rich, the results of his polygraph test raised some doubts. However, evidence of his involvement in the crime was also not found. Forensic experts examined Stacy's car and all the items found at the crime scene, but were unable to detect any third-party fingerprints or DNA. Without direct leads, investigators found themselves at an impasse and had to dig deeper. Soon, a call came from a local hospital about a suspicious man who had shown up in the middle of the night in blood-stained clothing. Detectives immediately went to interrogate him and sent the clothes for DNA analysis. The man claimed that he had fought with his girlfriend and denied any involvement in the murders. Despite his testimony, the police decided to detain him until the results from the lab were received. However, the examination showed that the blood on his clothes did not belong to either Stacy or Jacob. Having no connection to the crime, the man was released. Sometime later, the detectives had a new lead. They learned that before picking up her son, Stacy had stopped by a grocery store. When they checked the surveillance camera footage, they noticed a man talking to her. Unfortunately, they could not identify him, and this lead also turned out to be a dead end. The next clue came from Stacy's phone. Investigators found that the last incoming call was from a man named Scott. When questioned, Scott said that he was at home with his wife and children. He also admitted that he and Stacy had briefly dated earlier, but the relationship ended when she found out about his marriage. Despite the breakup, they remained on friendly terms, and his wife confirmed his alibi for the night of the murders. However, something about Scott aroused suspicion. According to Stacy's friends, he once left her a $100 tip at the cafe where she worked. Considering that Scott had a low-paying job and a family to support, this gesture seemed unusual to investigators. Digging deeper, they began to suspect that Scott might have been involved in drug dealing. But although this was an interesting lead, it did not bring them closer to solving the double murder. 2 weeks after the murder of Stacy and Jacob, something unexpected happened. The police found Scott's body in the trunk of an abandoned car. His brother told investigators that on the day of his disappearance, Scott was planning to meet with a man named Vince. The brothers did odd jobs repairing cars and had installed an expensive audio system in Vince's car. But Vince never paid them, so Scott went to demand the money. That's why his brother was sure that it was Vince who killed Scott. The police found Vince, who denied his involvement. However, during a search of his apartment, traces of Scott's blood were found, and it also turned out that Vince had used Scott's credit card after his death. Vince was arrested, and detectives investigating the case of Stacy and Jacob interrogated him, hoping that he knew something about Scott's possible involvement in their murders. Unfortunately, Vince did not provide any useful information, and this lead also turned out to be futile. For months, the case was stalled, but shortly before the trial, Vince unexpectedly decided to plead guilty. He claimed that he killed Scott in self-defense, as he was threatening him. According to Vince, Scott confessed that he killed Stacy because she was planning to tell his wife about their affair. Vince also added that he and Scott were involved in drug dealing. However, the detectives were in no hurry to believe Vince's story. The timing of its appearance seemed too convenient. Just before the trial for murder, he shifts another murder onto Scott, adding accusations of criminal activity and conveniently presenting his actions as self-defense. But in the absence of other leads, the police had to investigate Scott's possible connection to Stacy's murder. The deeper they dug, the less plausible Vince's story seemed. Scott's wife insisted that he was at home with her that night and could not have been on the other side of town committing murder. His brother also rejected the idea of an ongoing affair between Scott and Stacy, saying that Scott would have definitely told him about it, since the brothers were very close. Moreover, Scott's brother insisted that he had no connection to drug dealing. According to him, both brothers made an honest living repairing cars. The detectives eventually concluded that Vince's story did not correspond to reality and was only a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for his own crime. After that, the case hit a dead end. Over time, it was put in the archives, and there was no real progress. The only person who continued to look for answers remained Stacy's mother. She tirelessly reached out to detectives, but one by one they either retired or transferred to other departments. At some point, she was told that the case would be transferred to the cold case unit in Seattle, but when she tried to contact them, it turned out that the unit had been closed due to budget cuts. In the early 2000s, the police received information about a new suspect. An inmate contacted investigators, claiming that his acquaintance named Charles confessed to the murder of Stacy and Jacob. According to the informant, Charles worked with Stacy in the same cafe, and both were involved in drug sales. Allegedly, Stacy threatened to turn him in to the police, which led to the murder. The detectives found this story implausible, but in the absence of other leads, they decided to study Charles's possible involvement more deeply. They sent all the available evidence back to the lab for reanalysis, hoping that modern technology could detect traces of DNA missed during the initial investigation. But there was a serious problem. The lab was overloaded with other cases, and the detectives were told that they would have to wait a whole year for the results. In 2002, the detectives finally received the long-awaited call. Using modern methods, experts successfully identified traces of DNA on gloves and duct tape found at the crime scene, and found a match. But it wasn't Charles. The DNA belonged to a completely different man who had never come to the attention of the police. This man turned out to be Jerome Jones, a name that had never before appeared in the case file. Investigators began to study his past and discovered a long criminal history that stretched back to his teenage years. Jones had been arrested for robbery, assaults, car theft, and drug-related crimes. And in 1995, just a year after the murder of Stacy and Jacob, Jones and an accomplice killed a businessman near his home in California, for which he received a life sentence in 1998. Detectives also found out that in 1994, Jones lived in the same residential complex where Stacy had previously lived before moving due to safety issues, and where her babysitter lived at the time of the murders. Even more chilling was the fact that Jones worked at the club where Stacy celebrated her birthday with friends. Detectives went to another state to interrogate Jones in prison, but he denied any involvement in the murders. Each subsequent attempt to make him talk yielded no results, but direct DNA analysis confirmed that the biological material found on the gloves and duct tape at the crime scene belonged to him. However, a serious problem arose. The DNA on the gloves and tape was considered indirect evidence. The detectives understood that this would not be enough for a conviction, so they requested an analysis of biological samples taken from the victims' bodies during the initial investigation, which were stored in a repository. This time, the experts made a breakthrough. In the samples taken from Stacy's mouth, they identified biological material that matched Jones' DNA. This not only further confirmed his involvement, but also indicated that Stacy had been a victim of sexual assault. Soon, new evidence appeared. Jones's DNA was also found under Stacy's fingernails, which became another direct piece of evidence linking him to the crime. With all the evidence in hand, the detectives turned to the district attorney to discuss filing murder charges against Jones, but they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The prosecutor was not convinced that the available evidence was sufficient to directly link Jones to the double murder. Therefore, he asked forensic experts to reconstruct the crime scene using the new evidence, hoping to get a clearer picture of how Jones could have been connected to the crime. What happened next remains unclear, but for some reason the case stalled again. It is unknown whether the prosecutor's request for a reconstruction of the crime scene was ever carried out, but in the end, charges against Jones were never filed. Perhaps the investigators felt less pressure to pursue the case since Jones was already serving time for another murder, or they feared that the available evidence was not enough for a conviction. As a result, the case was put off again, despite numerous DNA matches linking Jones to the crime. But the saddest thing is that the police never informed Stacy's mother about these discoveries, although she tirelessly sought progress in the investigation. For years, Stacy's mother continued to reach out to investigators, but over time, the officers changed, and she eventually lost contact with everyone who was in charge of the case. Determined to find answers, she began to review all available information about the case with the help of her sister. These efforts lasted 15 years until her sister passed away in 2017. Since then, Stacy's mother continued the search alone, but every attempt to achieve justice led to a dead end. In 2019, a journalist from Seattle became interested in the case. He contacted Stacy's mother and began to dig into the investigation. Eventually, he discovered that the police had established a DNA match from the victim's body to Jerome Jones more than 15 years ago. Shocked by this revelation, he could not understand why charges were never brought against Jones, despite such compelling evidence. When he shared this information with Stacy's mother, she was devastated. She could not believe that all this time the police had a suspect linked to the case by numerous DNA samples, but never took action. The journalist contacted a former detective who had worked on the case during those years and asked why Stacy's mother was not informed about the DNA match. The detective explained that the evidence seemed too inconclusive at the time to make final conclusions. He also admitted that he was simultaneously working on numerous cases and simply did not have the time. The journalist asked the district attorney the same question. He replied that he did not consider it his responsibility to inform the families of victims about the development of the case, so he did not even think to contact her. Finally, the journalist gathered all the available information into a detailed article. The story caused a significant public outcry, almost instantly renewing interest in the case of Stacy and Jacob. When a new team of detectives reviewed the evidence collected by their predecessors, they too were struck by the fact that charges had not been brought against Jerome Jones, and they began preparing the case for trial. Around this time, the situation took an unexpected turn. Jerome Jones, who was still serving time for another murder, was granted parole, although he was supposed to remain behind bars at least until 2030. This created a sense of urgency for the detectives and prosecutors, so they rushed to file charges against him before his release. In early 2022, they finally brought formal charges, and Jones was arrested. Immediately after his release from a California prison, he was extradited to the state of Washington and taken into custody pending trial. Unfortunately, Stacy's mother did not live to see the day when the man responsible for the death of her daughter and grandson would be brought to justice. She passed away just 4 months after Jones' arrest. Despite this, the prosecution was determined to see the case through and achieve justice for Stacy and her son. Based on all the available evidence, they presented their version of the events of that fateful night. According to investigators, Jones attacked the woman almost immediately after she left the babysitter's house. He either forced her to stop by, threatening her with a weapon, or she stopped for some reason, and that's when Jones approached her car. According to the prosecution's theory, Jones' initial plan was to steal the car, but in the process, he decided to sexually assault Stacy. He forced her to get out of the car and tied her hands, but during the struggle, she managed to break free. She ran back to the car where her son had been sitting the whole time, and that's when Jones shot them both. After that, he pulled their bodies onto the road, planning to drive away in the car, but he could not find the keys. They were stuck between the seat and the door. Eventually, he fled the crime scene, leaving behind several DNA samples. During preliminary hearings in May 2023, Jones pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. At the moment, the trial has not yet begun, and Jones remains behind bars. But with the available evidence, there is little doubt about his involvement, and if the jury finds him guilty, he faces life imprisonment. So, this case is finally approaching its logical conclusion, although it took 3 decades to get there. The most absurd thing about this story is that Jones could have been charged back in 2002, just 8 years after the murder, but for reasons that still remain unclear, it took a full 20 years to bring charges against him. Although Jones had been in prison the entire time, Stacy's mother remained in the dark for years, suffering from not being able to achieve justice for her daughter and grandson. And now, when Jones can finally be officially convicted of their murders, Stacy's mother will no longer be there to see justice prevail. This tragic story makes us think about many things. First, how important it is to take our own safety seriously, especially when it comes to late-night trips alone with a child. Perhaps if Stacy had asked the babysitter to keep her son until morning, or called a taxi, everything could have turned out differently. Secondly, this case demonstrates how critical timely response from law enforcement is to crimes. The fact that the killer could have been detained back in 2002, but this did not happen due to bureaucracy and negligence, makes us seriously think about reforming the system of investigating especially grave crimes. And most importantly, this story reminds us of the importance of not remaining indifferent. If it were not for the persistence of Stacy's mother and the journalistic investigation, justice may never have been served. Sometimes it is enough for one person to refuse to remain silent in order to move a case from a dead end. If you are interested in similar stories about high-profile criminal cases and their investigations, subscribe to the Detective Brooks Stories channel. We regularly publish new episodes about the most mysterious crimes and the path to justice. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments and don't forget to give it a like if the video touched you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next investigation.